Okay, why don't we get started? A hearty welcome to everyone, wherever you are. Good evening to those of you in Shanghai and within China Standard Time. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you outside China Standard Time and across in different time zones. So, welcome to our Center for Global Asia webinar series. This is the first event of the spring 2021 semester of this entire series. Okay, that we have been doing since the fall semester last year. So I'm very happy, okay, that today, okay, we're going to have a very rich event, listening, from two dance studies experts, with Professor Emily Wilcox, speaking on revolutionary bodies, the transnational history of modern Chinese dance. My name is Selena Hong, assistant professor of literature at NYU Shanghai, currently also acting as interim director of the Center of Global Asia, acting alongside our director, Professor Tansen Sen. I'd like to welcome all of you, okay, to this spring semester series again, okay, especially for those of you who have been following our webinars since the last semester. So we have been doing this webinar series since fall, with speakers coming from different fields, but particularly last semester, we have been focusing on the fields of history, literature, specifically comparative literature, on the themes of global Asia. This semester, we continue this wonderful tradition, and we are going to have another series of webinars, listening from speakers from fields such as today, dance studies. Next time, a scholar, an eminent film scholar, Gina Marchetti from Hong Kong University, in March, in middle of March, March 16, talking about Hong Kong cinema. And at the end of March, on March 26th, okay, we're going to hear from Professor Edward Alpers from UCLA, from the fields of history, okay, to talk about Indian Ocean studies. So here is just some brief previews of what's coming up next in March. We will have more webinars, of course, in April and in May, okay, from fields including history, literature, anthropology, and international relations. So please feel welcome to subscribe to Center for Global Asia mailing list, or check our websites for regular updates of our events. So today, okay, I'm happy, okay, first of all, okay, to introduce our moderator, Professor Sia Tao, who will chair today's event and help us facilitate the conversation with Professor Emily Wilcox after her talk. So let me introduce Professor Sia Tao first. Sia Tao is an assistant arts professor at NYU Shanghai. She holds a master's degree of dance performance and a BA of dance education from Zhongyang Minzu Daxue, or Minzu University of China in Beijing. Professor Tao's research interests are Chinese minority and folk dance and stage performance. Professor Tao has focused in both her research but also teaching on Chinese minority and folk dance for more than 10 years, such as traditional Tibetan dance, Mongolian dance, Uyghur dance, Yanbian Chaoxianzu's dance, Dai dance from Daizu, and Chinese classical dance. In addition to teaching dance courses, Professor Tao also participates in NYU Shanghai's Dance for Camera, Choreography, Design, and Editing. Professor Tao also performs and choreographs today, most recently at the Avignon Festival in France, the Beijing Modern Dance Festival, the Power Station of Art in Shanghai, the Shanghai Museum of Glass, and the Guangdong Modern Dance Festival. So, that's our moderator. Welcome, Professor Sia Tao, and she will now introduce Professor Emily Wilcox, and I will leave the floor to Professor Tao.
Thank you, Selena, and thanks to our Center for Global Asia for hosting this event. And hello, everyone. I'm Sia Tao. I'm so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Emily Wilcox. And so let me call her Emily from now on. Emily is Associate Professor of Chinese Study in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at College of William Murray. She's also an affiliate of Liberal Center for Chinese Study at University of Michigan. She is a leading scholar of Chinese dance and performance with broad interests in 20th century global history, transnationalism, and social movements. Her first book, Revolutionary Body, Chinese Dance and the Socialist Legacy, won the 2019 Directorial Bueno Prize. She is the co-editor of Corporeal Politics, Dancing East Asia, and co-creator of the Pioneer of Chinese Dance Digital Photograph Archive. Emily has published more than 20 journal articles and book chapters, both in English and Chinese. She has taught at the University of Michigan for 7 years, where she served as Associate Professor, Associate Chair, and the Director of Graduate Study in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. I have heard Emily's name years ago. Actually, it's my personal honor to have her here today with our NYU Shanghai community. And so today's Emily's talk will run for about 1 hour, and then we will have a half-hour Q&A section. So our audience, you're welcome to type your question in the chat box below in this webinar. So let's give a big welcome to Professor Emily Wilcox.
Thank you so much, Sia. Let me just go ahead and share screen. Well, hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Center for Global Asia and to Tencent Sen for this introduction. And thanks, Selena and Sia, for opening this event. And I especially want to thank everyone who's here in the audience. I see a lot of friends from around the world who are joining us today. So it's really wonderful to be able to be together virtually. So today I'll be speaking about my book, Revolutionary Bodies, Chinese Dance and the Socialist Legacy, published by the University of California Press. And I'm very happy to share the information that this book received a special grant to be able to be published open access. So the book can be freely downloaded in full anywhere in the world for free. And so I encourage you, if you are interested in learning more after the talk, to download the book. And I'm also happy to announce that a Chinese language version of Revolutionary Bodies will be coming out this year with Fudan University Press. So stay tuned for that, which should be coming out in the next few months. One of the exciting aspects of the University of California platform is that it allows integration of multimedia into the actual book itself. Am I frozen? It's okay?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So the book incorporates 19 short dance videos that I analyze in the book. And the way that it's integrated is, you can see an example here. If you're reading the ebook, you can go ahead and click on the link, or if you're reading the physical book, you can scan the QR code and it allows you to actually see the dance that's being analyzed. So it's a really exciting new way of doing dance studies scholarship that I really appreciate. So the book is actually a history of the genre that we now today know as Chinese dance. And since I imagine some people in the audience may have more or less familiarity about Chinese dance, I wanted to start out with a couple of videos that show Chinese dance as it's practiced in contemporary China. So this is a video that I took at the Beijing Dance Academy in 2018, showing a class practicing a Chinese classical dance choreography. And for those of you who are familiar with Chinese performing arts, you'll see that elements of the movement vocabulary are closely related to Xiqu aesthetics. So Chinese opera movement is a really important foundation for the Chinese classical dance aesthetic, especially in this particular style of Chinese classical dance. But you'll also notice that there are some balletic elements incorporated into the movement. So this is a somewhat hybrid form, and that's something that I'll talk about more today, is how Chinese dance, because of its 20th century history, is actually a quite global and culturally complex art form. So this gives you an idea of one of the subgenres of Chinese dance, which is called Chinese classical dance. So I just saw a note saying that is the music audible? Can you hear the music?
Yes, we can hear the music, but I think you're frozen. Your video is frozen. Sorry to disturb.
Okay.
Do you want to close the video and reopen it? Maybe it will be great. Oh, perfect.
Okay, better now.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So that's the Chinese classical dance style. Now we'll move on to another style within Chinese dance. So this is a video that I took at the Xinjiang Dance Academy in 2017. So Chinese dance includes dance styles that represent different ethnic minority groups across the country. So this dance style represents the Uyghur group, one of the several Central Asian ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang. And you can see that from a movement perspective, the aesthetic is quite different from what you just saw with Chinese classical dance. The music is also different. The body rhythms are also distinctive to this region. So Chinese dance is an extremely diverse form that has many different substyles that represent different periods in Chinese history, different ethnic groups, and also different geographic locations across China. The next example here is another form of ethnic minority dance. This is a video that I took in the Inner Mongolia Arts University. And I especially like this video because it gives you a sense of how live musical accompaniment incorporating Minzu instruments or different types of ethnic instruments are actually an important part of the classroom training process. So again, each of these styles has a distinctive movement vocabulary, as well as a musical soundscape, as well as different type of choreographic themes. So in Inner Mongolian dance, you often see movements that evoke the sense of a wide space. Oftentimes dancers talk about the experience of being on an open grassland environment, which is really common in the Inner Mongolian region. And so, for example, you'll see movements that are quite expansive, that gesture out into the distance. There are some movements that imitate animal movements that are associated with the grassland environment. But also, like I mentioned with Chinese classical dance and the elements of ballet, in Inner Mongolian dance or Mongolian ethnic dance, with the floor work here, you can see some elements of Euro-American modern dance are incorporated into this dance style. And from a historical perspective, that has to do with the fact that one of the early founders of this style, Jia Zuoguang, was actually trained early on by a modern dancer from Japan, Shi Jingmo or Ishibaku. So again, this is a style that represents indigenous cultures, but also has a transnational history. And the last example I'll show here, I took in Diyalian Arts College in Northeast China in 2018. And this is showing an example of Han folk dance. So this is what's known as the Dongbei Yanga style. Yanga is a style of Han folk dance that's really common across North China as well as East China. And here you can see the use of the handkerchiefs is a common feature of that form. The music, as you can see again, it's a totally different soundscape from the other three videos I just showed. And this takes a lot of inspiration from local folk performance, as well as different types of ritual performances, especially from rural folk culture. So what I'm talking about in the book is specifically a style of Chinese dance that's practiced in a conservatory context. So all of the videos I just showed were taken in professional dance schools. So I'm not talking about what some people call, in context folk dance or folk dance that sort of exists in a rural environment. And I'm also not talking about actual ancient dances that existed in China thousands of years ago, or even amateur dance, which is extremely popular in China today and often practiced in parks and other types of popular venues. All of those are really important components of Chinese dance research in general. But what I'm talking about today is specifically the style of Chinese dance that is taught in professional schools and that is performed and produced for the concert stage. So this style of Chinese dance includes, as I mentioned, many different styles, including Chinese classical dance, Han folk dance, and ethnic minority dance. Those are the three main groupings. And what unites all of these forms is that they are all inspired by research into those wide-ranging, diverse local materials that I just mentioned. So historical dances, Chinese opera, folk dances, religious dances, ethnic minority dances all serve as the source of inspiration for this concert dance practice. And it's important to note that Chinese dance is practiced very widely in China, but it's also extremely common around the world wherever there are large Sinophone or diasporic communities. So just over the weekend, I was speaking at a concert event that was hosted in the United States that featured around 10 schools and ensembles that are based across the United States that are performing Chinese dance at a really high professional level. And this is something we also see in places like Singapore and Malaysia and Southeast Asia, as well as across the world. So as I mentioned, there's two sort of main sub-styles of Chinese dance. One is 中国民族民间舞, which is translated in different ways. Chinese national folk dance, Chinese minority and folk dance, or Chinese ethnic and folk dance are different ways that that's translated. And then the other major style is Chinese classical dance. So I think it's important to keep in mind the widespread popularity of this dance form in China. So based on a 2016 study by the Chinese National Academy of Arts, they documented around 1,500 officially staged performances of Chinese dance across the country just in that year. And this actually made up more than half of all dance performances that were formally staged in concert venues. And this is also including dance performances by international companies that were touring in China that year. So we can see that Chinese dance is the most widespread form of professionally produced concert dance in China, with ballet being the next most common and modern and contemporary dance after that. So contemporary choreography in the genre of Chinese dance is extremely dynamic, and there's new choreography coming out constantly with a huge number of young choreographers working within this genre now. So I mentioned this to sort of talk about why I decided to focus on Chinese dance in my book. This had to do in part with a recognition that the scholarship that had come about before I started working on revolutionary bodies that was written in English had a tendency to focus on dance styles that had originated in the West, such as ballet, Euro-American modern dance, and social dance or ballroom dance. And so these are some examples of books that had been published earlier on in English that talked about dance in China, but did not focus on Chinese dance. And so I really felt after understanding the dance world in China that Chinese dance deserved more attention. So the sources that I use in the book are actually quite, they reflect an interdisciplinary approach to dance research. So I started out, I was actually trained as an ethnographer and as an anthropologist. And so I started out, as many dance scholars do, with physical practice. I was fortunate to receive a Fulbright fellowship from the United States government and was able to serve as a visiting doctoral student at the Beijing Dance Academy for 3 semesters. And through that experience, I gained a kinesthetic, physical understanding of many of the different styles of Chinese dance. And that physical training was actually the basis for my understanding and appreciation of Chinese dance forms. And I think I'm in agreement with most dance scholars when we say that this kind of corporeal knowledge is a really critical component of dance research. Not only does it give you a physical understanding of the dance form, but having the experience of learning Chinese dance in the professional classroom also provides an understanding of the specific terminology that's used to describe different Chinese dance movements, as well as the aesthetic expectations and values that are involved in performing Chinese dance. In a way that's considered to be in tune with the aesthetic expectations of professional dancers. So all of that is a really important basis for the research that I do on Chinese dance. As an anthropologist, I was also very interested in hearing personal stories of dancers. And so I ended up conducting 200 oral history interviews with professional dancers from different parts of China and of different ages. But in particular, I really found it extremely valuable and enlightening to learn the life stories of the older generation of dancers who had been involved directly in the creation of Chinese dance in the 1940s and 50s. And so through this oral history research, I started to gain a deeper interest in the historical development of Chinese dance in China. Of course, a very important part of dance ethnography is attending performances, gaining an understanding not only of the choreography, but also of how the choreography interacts with the audience, what audiences respond to, what types of venues certain dances are performed in, things like ticket price, what dances sell out right away, what aren't as popular, and then also just getting a sense of the wide spectrum of dance that's being performed in any given week, because only a very small percentage of this ever really gets recorded or documented. And so seeing it live is the best way to get a sense of the full spectrum of what's happening. As many of you may know, there's an extremely vibrant scholarly scene of researchers writing in Chinese about Chinese dance. So as a scholar, I feel that one of my most important communities who are interlocutors in my research are the authors of these Chinese language books about Chinese dance history. And so these books serve as an important part of my research. However, as a scholar writing, my own history of Chinese dance, I felt that it was important not to rely on the existing studies of Chinese dance history. And I really use these as a resource, but for myself, focus more on returning to the primary sources and interpreting them for myself. So when I was writing the book, I started to realize that there was actually a really large source base of dance recordings of films that had been made dating back to the 1940s, documenting Chinese dance choreography from different decades. And so these dance films became a very important primary source research material in the process of writing my book. In addition to dance videos, there's also a huge amount of textual documentation of Chinese dance history in the published record of newspapers, bulletins, and magazines, as well as dancer memoirs. But I also was able to access a large amount of archival materials that were unpublished, such as internal documents, dancers' personal photo archives, as well as performance programs. So all of this material ended up becoming the basis for Revolutionary Bodies, which is really a chronological study of the history of Chinese dance. And because today's talk is part of the Center for Global Asia, I want to especially emphasize the transnational component of Chinese dance history in today's talk. So the historical outline for the book has several different important contributions that I'll mention here, and then I'll unpack each of them one by one in the rest of today's talk. So the first one is that through this historical research, I really identified the 1940s as a critical moment when Chinese dance began to coalesce as a new dance style. And this was a moment, as we know, of not only war in China, but also intensive intercultural exchange, as well as migration and revolution. Additionally, one of the really interesting discoveries that I made in the process of writing this book was that the early creators of Chinese dance, despite the fact that this is a form that's today considered to represent the nation state of China, in fact, the artists who contributed to creating the form were quite diverse, and not all of them were even from China. So there are diasporic artists, ethnic minority artists, and as well as immigrant artists who all made major contributions to the creation of this dance form. And I think it's also important to recognize that there's a huge contribution of women in Chinese dance history. And in some ways, this contrasts other areas of modern Chinese culture, such as literature, film, music, and visual arts, where male artists tend to dominate the historical conversation. So dance is a space where we can really see the contributions of women to the construction of Chinese national culture in the modern age. I also discovered that Chinese dance actually flourished in China during the 1950s and 60s. And this was actually the period in which it was institutionalized as China's leading national dance form, and also sent all over the world as a representative of Chinese socialism. By contrast, the rise of ballet that occurred in the subsequent period during the Cultural Revolution in many ways represented a departure from this earlier focus on Chinese dance. And so to gain an understanding of dance in socialist China broadly, we have to recognize that this is not a monolithic period, and it's also not a period in which ballet dominated throughout the entire Maoist era. It was actually a later development, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. I also realized that in the late 1970s, even though we typically think of that period as a time of a departure from socialist culture, if we look specifically at dance history, that was actually in many ways a return and a revival of socialist dance from the pre-Cultural Revolution era. And so as a result, we see the late 70s and the early 80s as a time of a second flourishing of Chinese dance, both domestically and internationally. And then lastly, because I do end the book by talking about the 21st century, I find that choreography and teaching practices in China are in many ways expanding and transforming, but also persisting some unacknowledged legacies of the socialist era. So if we think about some of the early precursors to Chinese dance in the very early parts of the 20th century, there are figures who started to experiment in ways that laid a foundation for the later development of Chinese dance. One of these is Yu Rongling, who was the daughter of a Qing ambassador. She was also ethnically Eurasian, and she was a student of Isadora Duncan, one of the most famous founders of early modern dance in the West. She studied in Isadora Duncan's school and performed in her works in Paris around 1902. And then she returned to the Qing court and performed for the Empress Dowager Cixi. And some of the choreographies that she created, she actually called Chinese dance. And so Yu Rongling staged some of these dances in the Qing court. And many people see that in China as the origin of the modern staging of Chinese dance in a concert context. Mei Lanfang is someone who I'm sure is very familiar to everyone. He's one of the most famous Chinese opera stars of the 20th century. And recently, scholars such as Catherine Ye and others have argued that Mei Lanfang, one of his major contributions to Chinese opera was the expansion of dance as an expressive mode within theatrical productions. And many of the dance choreographies that he developed together with his advisor Qi Rushan ended up becoming important foundations for especially Chinese classical dance choreography later in the century. And then lastly, Wu Xiaobang, who's often known as the father of modern dance in China. He studied in Japan, like many Chinese intellectuals and youth of his generation. And while he was there around 1930, around 1929 to 1930, he was exposed to what was then a burgeoning modern dance scene in Japan, in Tokyo. He ended up studying dance and really being a huge advocate for the introduction of Western style modern dance, in particular German style expressionist dance that he had studied in Japan. He introduced that back into China in the 1930s. And so all of these three figures can be seen in some ways as precursors to the later development of Chinese dance that I focus on in the book. I really focus on these four figures as individuals that I think could be seen as the founders of Chinese dance, people who laid the groundwork not only in terms of the choreography and performance, but also in terms of the theorization of this new dance form. So I'll talk about them each one by one. And in their biographies, we can immediately get a sense of the immense transnational component of this historical development of Chinese dance. So if we start with Dai Eileen, who's often known today as the mother of Chinese dance. She was a third or fourth generation, depending on which side of her family you look at, Chinese Trinidadian woman. She grew up in Trinidad. She did not speak Chinese growing up. She grew up in an English language environment. Of course, Trinidad was a British colony at the time. When she was a child, she started studying ballet in Port of Spain in Trinidad. And then when she was around 15, she and her mother and her sisters moved to England, and she continued to study ballet there. She also began to study European modern dance, and she actually established herself as a professional dancer in London, performing in cabaret performances. She was involved in some Asian themed modern dance performances, as well as some films. But she also experienced racial discrimination as a dancer of Asian ethnicity. And she was exposed not only to European dancers, but also to Asian dancers who were starting to create their own styles of Asian dance. Figures such as Uday Shankar, for example, who were widely touring and very popular at the time, creating modern styles of Asian dance. And so she gained this exposure and also became interested in creating her own choreographies based on Chinese themes. And as a result, she took the very bold move of traveling to Hong Kong in the middle of World War II. She arrived there in 1940 and spent a year in Hong Kong. And after that, she moved on to Chongqing, where she settled and began to develop what would later become Chinese dance choreography. The next important figure that I look at is a Uyghur dancer named Khambar Han. She was born in Kashgar in Northwest China in the 19-teens, and her family moved across Central Asia. They were migrant laborers, and she ended up as a child being recruited into a famous dance school in what is now Uzbekistan. She studied with the famous Uzbek dancer Tamara Khanum. And she actually became a professional performer in the Uzbek song and dance ensemble. She was then recruited to Moscow to continue to study and perform dance. She performed at the Kremlin alongside the famous Soviet ballerina Galina Ulanova. And then a couple of years later, she moved back to Xinjiang in the 1940s, around 1942, and launched her career in Xinjiang and also toured across China. And she also, like Dai Eileen, began to create choreography that later laid a foundation for Chinese dance. Another important figure is Chosinghi, or in Chinese, she's known as Cui Chengxi. She was a Korean dancer who traveled to Tokyo when she was a teenager and joined the dance ensemble of Ishibaku, one of the leading figures of Japanese modern dance. And Chosinghi became an extremely famous dancer in Japan, as well as in Korea. Of course, Korea was a colony of Japan at the time. Initially, she was performing and studying Western style modern dance and ballet, as well as some social dances, as you can see here. But in the mid-1930s, she started to create a new repertoire that was inspired by different elements of Korean traditional culture. And some of his works, like the ones you see here, were actually satirizing elements of that culture. But some of them were taking a more kind of serious interpretation. And so she developed a dance style that became known as Eastern dance or East Asian dance. And she took that style actually on a world tour. She was one of the first dancers from East Asia to perform really widely in North America, as well as Latin America and Europe in the late 1930s and early 40s. She returned to Asia when the war broke out in Europe. And she, like many professional dancers in the Japanese imperial sphere at that time, performed for the soldiers across the Japanese empire. And this was how she first ended up in China in the 1940s. She gave tours, 3 major tours in the early 40s, where she brought her Eastern style dances. And she began to develop dances on Chinese and Japanese themes in addition to Korean themes at that time. Interestingly, Chosinghi became friends with Mei Lanfang, the opera performer I mentioned earlier, while she was touring in China, and she actually decided to stay in China in 1944, 45, and 46, and she began to study Chinese opera during that time. There are interesting newspaper documents showing her in full Chinese opera attire, performing segments of Chinese opera at that time. And she started to become interested. There's documentation of her interviews talking about her desire to create a new dance style on the basis of Chinese opera. And this is around the 1940s. And lastly, Lianglin, he's the one of these four figures who was actually born and raised in China. He was born in southern China, and during the Sino-Japanese War, he ended up, like many people who were in the East Coast at that time, fleeing the invading Japanese armies and moving to Kunming. While he was in Kunming, he created two different styles of choreography. The one you can see on the bottom here is more of a modernist style. So Lianglin had actually studied with Wu Xiaobang, the dancer I mentioned earlier, who tried to promote European-style modern dance in China in the 1930s. So the image that you see on the bottom is a choreography that Lianglin created in wartime Kunming that was critiquing the nationalists' government handling of the wartime economy, and particularly the food shortages and the high inflation. So highly political themed work using a modernist style. But then at the same time, he was also creating works, as you can see in the top image and the right-hand image, that were developed based on collaborations with local minority communities, specifically communities near Kunming. These were also politically themed works in the sense that they were part of a larger project to promote a multi-ethnic nationalism in China during the war, promoting this idea of Han ethnic minority cooperation. Lianglin ended up joining a group of progressive theater artists who traveled across Southeast Asia to promote their new performing arts forms to the Chinese diasporic communities abroad. So he spent 2 years in Thailand, Malaya, and Singapore, and actually became one of the first figures, along with Dai Eileen, to promote the newly created Chinese dance forms abroad. At the same time, Dai Eileen also spent a year in the United States performing for Asian American audiences there. So there's sort of a two-way flow happening with the very early years of Chinese dance, where you have people coming from abroad, bringing expertise that they gained in other countries. At the same time, right, almost simultaneously, you have dancers then bringing the new choreography that they create back out to the international community. So these are some photographs of works that were toured in Southeast Asia. You can see a Uyghur themed dance here on the bottom. And then also this piece here was a piece that Lianglin choreographed based on Burmese dance. So he was also creating new works based on Southeast Asian dance while he was touring the Chinese dances in Southeast Asia. So I see these figures as the founders of the genre, as I mentioned, because both in their choreography and in their theorization, they lay the foundations for what continued to be really core elements of Chinese dance going forward. So in the book, I call these three core commitments. These are elements that we see continuing to really inform the creation of Chinese dance and the theorization of Chinese dance as it's practiced today. And these were all theoretical points that these four figures advocated in their early writings and performances in the 1940s. So the first one is this idea of kinesthetic nationalism, or the idea that you see appear in a lot of the publications that these writers published in the 1940s, that they were really seeking a new dance form that would be unique to China. And they felt that it was form specifically rather than thematics that defined Chinese dance, this new form of Chinese dance, as something unique to China. The second idea is this idea of spatial or ethnic inclusivity. So the early choreographies and the early theorizations really highly value the representation of different ethnic groups and different regions within China, and felt that a national dance form in China should encompass all of this diverse range of cultures that exist in China at that time. And then lastly, it was very interesting to realize that even from the early years of the creation of Chinese dance in this period in the 1940s, the choreographers were very clear about the fact that they were not reproducing existing dance styles. This was not a project of complete preservation or something that was concerned with a limited notion of authenticity, but actually the dancers talk about their work in terms of blending research with innovation. And so they see their own authorship actually as one component in terms of their creation of new works, they have agency to reinterpret the traditional material that they're working with. And that's an inherent part of how they envision the value of this dance form in the contemporary period. And so, as I said, these are all theoretical underpinnings that we continue to see as really core elements of Chinese dance practice in the 21st century. So we can see some examples of this in early publications from the 1940s. There's a famous speech that was published in 1946 in the Zhongyang Ribao, the Central Daily News, which was one of the leading newspapers in China at the time. And this was attributed to Dai Eileen and was published together with reports of a major performance that she staged called the Frontier Song and Dance Plenary, Bianjiang 舞蹈音乐大会 that she staged in Chongqing. And this event is often seen as sort of a starting point, particularly of Chinese minority and folk dance in China, but also Chinese dance in general. And so in this speech, she says that for the past 3 years, she had sort of been mistaken in her direction. She had been working to create Chinese dance dramas, she says, in which the content was Chinese and the performers were Chinese, yet according to her, we cannot say that it was a truly Chinese dance drama. And this next sentence, I think, is particularly critical. So she says, we used foreign technique and footwork to tell the story. It was like using a foreign language to tell a Chinese tale. And this was quite obvious to the audience. We can say that the work of the past 3 years took the first step in establishing dance as an independent art. But as for creating Chinese dance, it was a mistaken direction. So I believe that here we can see an early formulation of kinesthetic nationalism, this idea that Chinese dance form, here she's comparing it to a language, that it's that form that needs to be developed so that it is a form or a language that is recognizable and understandable to Chinese audiences. And she's really calling for the need to create that. And later in the same essay, she actually outlines a plan for creating such a form. And this plan includes, for example, going out to conduct field research on actually existing folk, ethnic, and ritual dance performance and using that as the basis to create this new movement language. Another example is from a recorded interview that took place between Mei Lanfang, or it's more of a conversation between Mei Lanfang and Chosinghi in 1945 when Chosinghi was living in Shanghai. And so in this conversation, there's an important moment when Mei Lanfang asks Cui Chengxi or Chosinghi what the role of tradition is in her own choreography. And she responds, I do not completely follow inherited dances that previous people have passed down. Some say new creation is destructive to tradition. I rather believe that new creation has always been the normal development of tradition. In the past, our ancestors' artistic creations were passed down and became today's art traditions. The new creations of today's artists will also become the traditions of future generations. So this expresses that idea of dynamic inheritance, that the artists who were involved in creating Chinese dance actually saw themselves in a dynamic process of constantly reinterpreting and recreating tradition. And that was the mission that they themselves took on in their staging of these dance forms. So we can see some examples of this dynamic inheritance of tradition and the development of these new forms of dance that were attempting to present a specifically Chinese dance movement vocabulary. So for example, Dai Eileen conducted field research with Tibetan communities in what is now Western Sichuan and developed Tibetan themed choreographies at that time. She also studied with local opera actors. So this piece, The Mute Carries the Cripple, which is one of her most famous early works, was created on the basis of a scene from Gui opera, the local opera style of Guangxi province. And so you can see she's developing this into a specifically dance choreography, but the movement vocabulary draws heavily on the Chinese local opera performance style. And here you can also see a very folkloric aesthetic with the use of this puppet element in the performance. There's also, as the work, you'll see as the work develops, there's sort of comedic elements. There's the use of the fan, this really important prop that we see in a lot of our regional performance styles. So it's very clear from this video that Dai Eileen put great effort into changing her movement vocabulary from one that had previously been grounded in ballet and European style modern dance, and really changing the way she moved on stage to adopt these local movement forms. And so this practice of learning and translating these local performance practices into a concert dance choreography was really the model that she gave for other choreographers, which became the basis for the method that was used to create Chinese dance going forward. And this recording, interestingly, was made in New York. So as I mentioned, the transnational history is just evident throughout this, this story. This was taken while she and her husband, the painter Ye Qianyu, were traveling in the United States. And so it's recorded and held in Columbia University Library today. At the same time, we also have, so in contrast to Dai Eileen, who was a diasporic artist who was of Han ethnicity, her family came from South China. You also had ethnic minority artists who were also promoting ethnic minority dance on the national stage at this time. So in 1947, there was a tour of dancers from Xinjiang and musicians from Xinjiang who traveled all across China. They even went to Taiwan and really played an important role in promoting Northwest ethnic minority arts as something that people began to envision as a symbol of Chinese culture, and something that you see in the newspaper reviews of the time. It really opened the eyes of many of the urban Han communities who were previously unfamiliar with these forms, but began to see them as sort of part of this new multi-ethnic national culture that was circulating throughout China, particularly in the context of the Civil War, when there was the ethnic politics were actually being advocated by both the KMT and the CCP. So both sides were really advocating for this multi-ethnic awareness. And this Xinjiang Arts Group ended up playing an important role in the development of that new national identity. At the same time, it promoted artists like Khambar Han, who you see performing here, into the national spotlight as stars in their own right within the Chinese community. And so here, if we look at this video, we can see she's performing a plate dance where she has plates in her hands and chopsticks. This is a dance that's still taught at the Xinjiang Art Academy today and still performed. And we can see many elements of Uyghur dance appearing in this, this choreography. And I'll talk more about the connection later. We do have some video of Chosinghi's Eastern style dances that she was touring and developing in China at this time. So there are examples like the one you see here, Bodhisattva dance, which take heavy inspiration from Buddhist art. You also see, this is another work that takes inspiration from Buddhist statue. This one, shaman dance, takes its inspiration from Korean shamanism. But of course, you can see that she's really interpreting it in much more of an entertainment mode. This piece is inspired by Chinese theatrical work, so it's a Chinese themed dance. So we can see in all of these choreographies the melding of modern stage aesthetics with a wide range of different kind of local material that is, being extracted or appropriated from different types of performing arts and then redeveloped for the stage persona of the artist. This is a video that was taken later when Chosinghi moved to Pyongyang in North Korea, and that's where she spent the remainder of her life as a leading figure in North Korean dance. We don't have any recordings of Lianglin's early choreography from the 1940s, but we do have some photographs, and we also have essays that he published in which he was really advocating for a similar vision of Chinese dance to the one that Dai Eileen and Chosinghi had advocated in the 1940s as well. And he actually published this piece while he was in Malaya. So these ideas were also disseminated to the broader diasporic community. So during the wartime period, we have different artists working in different parts of China who are experimenting in similar ways with the reinterpretation of local material on stage. And in 1949, when the People's Republic of China is founded, this is actually the moment when these artists come together and begin to collaborate actively to bring the different resources and ideas that they developed to create a national dance form. In addition to the artists that I just mentioned, of course, you also have the artists who are working in the communist areas, communist controlled areas of Northwest and North China in places such as Yan'an, in Yan'an, also in northern China, as well as in northeast China. So there's a whole group of artists who were performing what's known as Nuyanga or Xinyanga that really adapted the Han folk performance styles from rural communities. You can see an example here is the waist drum dance. And so they also brought these new works that they had created in the context of the Yan'an style of performing arts. And in many ways, it was similar to the approach that was being taken by the other artists I just mentioned, in the sense that it was also taking the folk forms and the indigenous performance practices as the basis to create something that was really engaging with contemporary social issues and contemporary aesthetics. So the first work that was created collaboratively by this group of artists from all over the country was Long Live the People's Victory, which was a celebration of the communist victory in the Civil War. And you can see from these archival photographs that it incorporated both the Yanga aesthetic as well as what was then known as the frontier dance aesthetic or the Bianjiang aesthetic of ethnic minority movement practices. There were other experiments that happened around this time in 1950 that took a sort of wider range of approaches to movement choreography. And it's interesting, so in chapter 2 of the book, I look at the critical responses to these different types of experiments, right in the early years of the People's Republic of China. And it's interesting to see how, on the one hand, there was space for this wide-ranging experimentation. On the other hand, there quickly emerged a critical consensus about what was the appropriate direction for Chinese dance choreography. So Peace Dove was a ballet work that was created in 1950. And this is Dai Eileen here. She was a star as well as one of the co-choreographers. And this work was based on the international peace movement. It was supposed to be commemorating the signing of the Stockholm Peace Treaty. But this work was heavily criticized by Chinese writers at the time who felt that ballet was much too old-fashioned and much too European to be appropriate for a revolutionary dance aesthetic that's meant to express a Chinese sort of anti-colonial or independent movement of Chinese nationalism. And so there was really an interesting critical dialogue about this piece that ended up coming to the conclusion that ballet was really not a good medium for representing revolutionary Chinese culture. At the same time, you had the creation of this other dance drama that Lianglin was one of the head choreographers for. At that time, he was based back in southern China and working with the Southern China Song and Dance Ensemble. He was leading the ensemble. And this piece was quite interesting because it was actually about the military invasion of Hainan Island and sort of the CCP victory of Hainan Island that had just happened shortly before the piece was staged. And the choreographers used a fieldwork-based research method where they went to interview soldiers, to ride in the boats, to sort of gain a firsthand experience of what the soldiers may have experienced in Hainan. And on the basis of that, they created this choreography that blended elements of Chinese opera music with modern dance, as well as sort of realistic depictions of staged battles. And this piece received a much more positive response from the critics, but the critics still felt that it didn't really present this specifically Chinese movement aesthetic, and that was the only thing that was lacking. And so in the response to those two pieces from 1950, there was a great debate about, what the future of Chinese dance should be. And interestingly, at the end of 1950, you had another ethnic minority dance tour that Khambar Han participated in. And this tour really gave the critics a sense that minority dance was an important source of movement vocabulary that could be incorporated into these large-scale dance dramas and into the training of dancers. And so as a result, this photograph shows Khambar Han with a group of students. So at the end of 1950, she was actually appointed to lead the establishment of the first dance program that was specifically designed to recruit and train ethnic minority artists. And this was based in Xi'an. And so she began to really develop a curriculum for training professionally trained ethnic minority dancers in China through that program. On the other hand, this is Chosinghi. So of course, we know that the Korean War had broken out in 1950. And In that context, Chosinghi was living in Pyongyang, and she had her own dance school there, and her school was bombed, and it became very dangerous for her to stay there. And so as part of the socialist diplomacy, Zhou Enlai invited Chosinghi to come back to China. We know she had been already living there for several years during World War II. So he invited her back, and she spent 1950, 1951, and part of 1952 actually working in Beijing, teaching at the Central Academy of Drama, an entire cohort of very young dancers that ended up going on to become leaders in the Chinese dance community. And they studied with Chosinghi, and one of the core aspects of this program that she taught was developing dance based on Chinese opera, as you can see here. So this led in the mid-1950s to the establishment of the Beijing Dance School, or what is now the Beijing Dance Academy. The Academy had two major programs. One was a ballet program and one was a Chinese dance program. The ballet program was largely led by Soviet instructors, but the Chinese dance program was led by local artists, and they invited people like Khambar and other specialists from across the country to train teachers to develop this Chinese dance curriculum. They also invited opera practitioners. And so the curriculum they developed really closely matches the Chinese dance curriculum that we have today, in the sense that it had as its focus Chinese classical dance, which is imaged here. Ethnic minority dance was part of the curriculum, and also Han folk dance was part of the curriculum. In the 1950s, we start to see the national institutionalization of Chinese dance as a national dance form, with the establishment of these dance ensembles. The first three are focused on Chinese dance. The fourth one is focused on dances of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And then the fifth one is ballet. So in the mid-1950s, basically starting from 1949 all the way up through 1962, China sent quite large delegations of dancers to the World Festivals of Youth and Students. And this was really where the newly created Chinese dances of the socialist era were promoted abroad as symbols of the new PRC culture. So in Amsterdam, there's an excellent archive documenting these events. And in the publications, you see dance is very present throughout the visual culture of these events. These were leftist international youth competitions and events where youth came together and participated in all different kinds of activities. But dance competitions were an important part of the events. And you can see from the images here that, ballet is featured, different types of national and ethnic dances are featured from around the world, as well as Eastern European folk dance was also a big part of the culture here. And so Chinese dance became very popular in these events. There's many documentations of Chinese performers in these publications from the festivals. We also see this poster from 1957 from the Moscow Festival, where you see dancers and musicians representing different parts of the world. And here on the top right, you see a figure representing China, and he's performing the Chinese ribbon dance. So this dance may be familiar to some of you. It was one of the most popular choreographies of Chinese dance in the 1950s and early 60s. It was originally staged in 1951, and then this recording is from 1963. But this dance, I think, exemplifies the approach to Chinese dance choreography in the 1950s, in the sense that it brought together, according to its creators, elements of Chinese opera performance, as well as this was made in Northeast China. So they also learned from local folk performers in Zhuan, a style of comedic duet performance, as well as Yanga performance. So they took all these local elements, they blended them together into a new choreography. They really built up this rural aesthetic, this idea that they were performing, the rural revolutionary avant-garde of China. But also they use this color red, which of course symbolized communism. At the same time, it symbolized Chinese folk culture. So in addition to works like Red Silk Dance, you also had a large number of works on ethnic minority themes that were part of the repertoires that were toured abroad at the World Youth Festivals, and also on a range of international tours at this time. So this piece, Ryoba on the Grassland, was co-created by an ethnic Tibetan choreographer who also starred in the work, and a Han choreographer. So they worked together to create the piece, and it brought together many different elements of Tibetan dance into one choreography. At the same time, you had works of Chinese classical dance, such as this one, performed by Dai Eileen. that also won awards at the World Youth Festivals and was also a critical component of this early Chinese dance curriculum. And I find this particularly interesting when we think about how we normally imagine Maoist or socialist femininity. I think this image really contrasts with the Iron Woman image that we often associate with the period. And I think it reminds us of the wide range of aesthetic practices that were happening in early socialist China. So there's a lot of really wonderful documentation of the international tours of Chinese dance in this period. This is an example of a program, as you can see, it's in Spanish, from 1960, when Chinese dancers toured Colombia and Cuba and Venezuela. We see here a map showing the different countries that Chinese dance tours visited during the early period of the socialist era, the 17 years period. We can see that Chinese dance actually was touring quite widely around the world. Of course, the United States is kind of conspicuously absent, because of the Cold War of this period. And so there's often a perception that China was closed off and was not connecting internationally at the time. But in fact, my research shows that there was a huge amount of artistic exchange happening. And so this is one way to sort of see that visualized here. We also see efforts during the same period to actually popularize the newly created Chinese dance repertoires within China with handbooks like this that taught people how to perform the new choreographies. We see the emergence of politically themed full-length narrative dance dramas that were using the newly created Chinese dance vocabularies. This becomes very popular in the late 1950s, and we have some full-length recordings of some of these works on film. So Magic Lotus Lantern was based on a widely circulating popular story called Pishan Jiumu. And it reinterpreted this story, which was about a romance between an immortal, a female immortal pictured here, and a human man. And the idea was that this was an ill-fated romance that was not allowed according to the quote unquote Confucian tradition. And so in the context of the 1950s, this piece was reinterpreted as a story about free marriage, a story about, some of the new ideals of gender equality and marriage choice that were being advocated by the socialist regime. And there's a really strong opera aesthetic throughout this piece. We also see Dagger Society, which was created in Shanghai in 1959, which is about the historic uprising in Shanghai in 1853, in which the Dagger Society actually fought against the Qing and the international imperialists that were in Shanghai at the time. So it's a really interesting example of how it starts out with the scene of a foreign opium trader in Shanghai as the setting the stage for this peasant revolt. And the choreography uses really strong elements of Chinese opera movement as the basis for the movement vocabulary. We also have a full-length recording of an ethnic minority themed dance drama from this period that is set during the Civil War, and really depicts this idea that ethnic minority revolutionaries were playing an important role in the Civil War and sort of uniting with the communists to fight the nationalists. And it's interesting that this piece really does engage in the issue of ethnic discrimination, and it depicts the nationalist army as quite discriminatory towards the local ethnic minority groups. And then this becomes part of the narrative that the choreographic team actually talk about as the intersection of class and ethnicity in Chinese Revolution. So there's a really rich kind of documentation of dance choreography that can be interpreted in terms of its ideological meanings, and then also how that ideology is conveyed through aesthetic choices. So in the mid-1960s, we see an emergence of a lot of new different approaches to Chinese dance choreography. So we see the creation of large-scale Chinese dance works. For example, The East is Red is the most prominent document that we have from this period. So it's sort of taking the Chinese dance choreography and blowing it up onto a massive scale, also combining it with choral singing and orchestra music. We also see the emergence of a large number of works that are on international themes. So for example, this piece from 1964 is about the American civil rights struggle. It centers on the abuse of a Black teenager by a white police officer in the United States. And then it depicts a group of people sort of fighting back against this discrimination. We also see new images of women in this period where we see much more kind of martial aesthetics. But what's interesting is they're not using ballet choreography as they do in the later revolutionary ballets that are also first being created at this time. But they're still using the more folk and classical opera inspired movement actions. And so it's a transitional moment, I would say, between the classical dance dramas and the revolutionary ballets. So during the Cultural Revolution, as I mentioned earlier, you do have a switch in which Chinese dance is replaced by ballet as the most widely promoted dance form. We also have full-length recordings of all 4 of these ballets from that era. And so in chapter 4 of the book, I talk about the history of ballet in China, which also, as we know, is highly transnational. So ballet was originally introduced in China by the White Russians prior to the arrival of the Soviet instructors. And then, of course, we have the Soviets who come in the 1950s, and then there are tours by Japanese and Cuban ensembles. And then we finally see this sort of appropriation of ballet as a medium for revolutionary opera and ballet in China. So there's interesting documentation of the early White Russian trained Chinese ballerinas. This is Hu Rongrong, who actually goes on to be the founding director of the Shanghai Dance School in 1960. But she was trained by a White Russian dancer in Shanghai prior to the founding of the People's Republic of China. And you can see her here performing Coppelia in 1948. In the 50s, you get the stagings of classical ballet works by the Soviet instructors. Then you get this really interesting period in the 1950s and 60s when ballet ensembles from non-Western countries, such as Japan and Cuba, are also performing. And I think this is part of what inspires the Chinese ballet dancers to start to create their own works on Chinese themes. And so the ballets are quite different from the choreography from the earlier period in the sense that the movement vocabulary is very strongly based on ballet. And there's just sort of elements of Chinese dance mixed in, but Chinese dance is by no means the primary vocabulary. And so it's important to keep in mind that the very moment the revolutionary ballet was being promoted was also the moment when Chinese dance was being suppressed, along with many other types of cultural forms that were either seen as traditional or Western. And so Chinese dance was really suppressed in the Cultural Revolution. And this is what made it possible for Chinese dance to sort of experience a revival in the post-Mao period, because it was seen as, it was consistent with the critique of the Cultural Revolution that was happening in the late 1970s. But at the same time, it was actually bringing back a lot of the choreographies and the dancers and the projects and the aesthetics that had been developed in the pre-Cultural Revolution period. So in the late 1970s, you see new choreographies being created that were that go on to actually become really foundational in Chinese dance going forward. So in 1979, you have this dance drama called The Peacock Princess, or Zhao Shu Tun Namunwana, which stars Yang Liping, who goes on to become one of the most famous performers and choreographers in Chinese minority and folk dance. And she's performing this image of the Peacock Princess that then becomes a central part of her choreography all the way up until the present day today. We also see the staging of the first full-length Dunhuang style Chinese classical dance drama inspired by the Mogao grottos in Dunhuang that also introduces a totally new dance vocabulary that's derived from the paintings in the Mogao caves. So I talk about in the book in chapter 5 about how these dances were they felt very new and fresh to audiences in the late 70s because they were so different from what had been promoted during the Cultural Revolution. But if we look at the historical trajectory, we actually see that these styles were starting to be developed in the 1950s and early 60s, and were actually a revival of these earlier socialist era projects. And so, for example, you see this piece from 1955 that called Apsaras that Dai Eileen created on the basis of the Buddhist imagery. It could be seen as a precursor to the Dunhuang choreography. We also see works on the Dai Peacock Princess theme that were developed in the 1950s and early 60s that served as precursors to Yang Liping's peacock dance that she developed in the 1980s. So, for example, there's this 1963 puppet animation film on the Peacock Princess that has dance choreography here that is actually quite similar to some of the choreographic and costume choices that we see in Yang Liping's later works. So I talk about how we can see this as an explicit example of the socialist legacy continuing and enduring after the end of the Cultural Revolution and even up until the present. So I'm wrapping up now, and I just want to talk a little bit about the very last chapter of the book, which looks at Chinese dance in the 21st century. So one of the things that we see happen in the 21st century, of course, is a further expansion of the concert stage to include television stage, different types of mediated performance practices. So for example, the televised dance performances become a really important space in which new choreographers and dancers gain fame and influence in the Chinese dance world today. So here we see one of the most famous Uyghur dancers in China today, Gulmira Mehmet, performing an Uzbek dance. She ends up winning one of the first seasons of So You Think You Can Dance China. So I talk about how she is interpreting and inheriting Khambar Han's tradition of Uyghur dance into the 21st century. She was trained by students of Khambar Han at the school that Khambar Han led in Xinjiang. We also see aesthetic continuities in choreographies of ethnic and folk dance that, for example, inherit the Lianglin aesthetic, such as the example here. As well as new full-length dance dramas that are very similar to the dance dramas of the 1950s in the sense that they're still closely connected to political ideology and events that are happening in contemporary China. So for example, this piece, Maritime Silk Road, is about a friendship that emerges between a Chinese trader at the time and what was then the island of Sri Lanka. And it just happens that this dance drama is staged in the year when China is setting up this container port in Sri Lanka. So it's very closely connected to the international relations of what then becomes the One Belt, One Road program. But interestingly, this piece was created by the Beihai Song and Dance Ensemble, and it's actually taking a lot of detailed archaeological excavation of the first maritime sea trade that began out of Beihai. So it's actually rooted in a real historical event that's then reinterpreted to sort of also fit with the current moment of One Belt, One Road. So the way that these works are created are quite interesting if we compare this, for example, to Dagger Society, also about a real historical event, but being interpreted in the context of the politics of the socialist period. And so then lastly, I talk in the book about some of the new directions in Chinese classical dance, in which choreographers are really starting to reflexively represent modern themes, as well as interactions between modern artists and their historical sources of material and inspiration on stage. So we have works like Rouge, which is a Chinese classical dance solo that takes as its source of inspiration a Hong Kong novella from the 1990s. And so this is really expanding what we could think of as Chinese classical dance thematics, which prior to this were tended to be focused more on classical poetry, stories from early pre-modern China. And so we start to see now the incorporation of more contemporary material, but still within this context of classical dance choreography. And then lastly, in this piece from 2013, this is where we really see the self-reflexive staging, not just of staging tradition, but of staging an interaction between a contemporary choreographer and some kind of historical relic. So this piece is really about the Song and the Tang and Song dynasties, sort of thinking broadly about the arts of those periods. But it starts out with the choreographer here, Zhang Yunfeng, representing a modern painter in the Dunhuang caves, and he's encountering a Dunhuang figure. And so it starts with this interaction between the two as a way to sort of think about what it means to reflect traditional aesthetics on a contemporary stage. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and conversation.
Thank you, Wilcox. Thank you, and it's such a rich and wonderful talk. I think a lot of material need to digest, and I think I see some questions from our audience. So let me just click the bottom. So let's see.
Sure,
Yeah. So there's a question from Well Wu. So what's the reason that motivates specifically concert dance is Chinese translation as research topic?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So in Chinese, usually the term that's used is 舞蹈艺术, so art dance or dance art. Sometimes people also say 剧场舞蹈, which is more of a direct translation of concert dance. So the reason that I decided to focus on this in the book is that, first of all, Chinese dance is such a dominant form of art dance in China that I think it's important when we think about Chinese dance to sort of take that on first as the sort of most widely seen style of this performance form. But apart from that, I also had my own sort of scholarly motivations for taking this subject. And one of those was I really wanted Chinese dance to be seen as an equal to other elite dance forms around the world. So ballet and modern or contemporary dance being the most prominent examples. And the reason for this is that historically in dance studies, there was a tendency to separate out art dance from ethnographic dance. And this was very much on a Western, non-Western binary. So historically, there was this idea that art dance only existed in the West and that non-Western dance forms sort of existed in the realm of ethnographic dance. And I really wanted to challenge that dichotomy, which had racist implications in terms of what was considered to be artistically sophisticated. And so I wanted to challenge that perception that non-Western dance forms are not artistically sophisticated enough to be considered part of the concert dance repertoire. We see this kind of implied in the way that dance is produced, for example, in the United States, where oftentimes non-Western dance companies are billed as cultural presentations, whereas Western dance companies are presented as art presentations. And so I really wanted to challenge that dichotomy and have us see Chinese dance as an art form, which is how Chinese dance practitioners also see what they're doing. And so that was, I think, one of the other deeper motivations for the reason that I specifically focus on that in the book. But that's a really great question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And there's another question from Joseph. And so it's when you find a resource, how do you approach its analyze? So
thank you. Yeah, this is a really great question. So
yeah.
It really depends on the type of source. So for example, sometimes I know about an important event in Chinese dance history, and I sort of know that it's significant. And so I use the source to try to better understand that event. And oftentimes, if it is a film, then I'm really using the source to analyze the choreography. And so doing an analysis of the movement primarily. But there are a lot of dance works that I write about in the book, such as that ballet from 1950, Peace Dove, also the work from the same year that was about the military victory in Hainan. So those two dances were not recorded on film. And so for those, I had to reconstruct them on the basis of photographs and textual descriptions. And so sometimes I'm using the sources as a way to analyze the movement. Sometimes I'm using the sources as a way to reconstruct a piece of choreography that we no longer have a recording of. But then other times, if I'm looking at the critical reviews, I'm more interested in the discourses that are being developed, and including things like the speech I referenced from Dai Eileen. So I'm looking at how the artists talk about their own intention, how they talk about their research process to sort of understand how the work was created. But then I'm also using the critical reviews to understand how the works were understood and received and evaluated in their own historical context. So I'd say it really depends on the type of source, but those are the types of questions that I ask when I'm encountering a source.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I see there's a lot of questions from our audience. So because we need to manage our time, so we'll choose some of the questions asked. Okay. So there's a question from Rachel. So she asked, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. My question is, what do you make of the current development of contemporary dance in China? It seems there are more dance companies that are not nationalized. So where you think, where would this form fit in the picture of your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So starting in the early 1980s, there was an increased interest in modern and contemporary dance from the West in China. And so you had dancers from the United States, from Australia, Canada, Europe. Some of the companies that we see today that are sort of the more independent contemporary dance companies are sort of coming out of that historical tradition of modern dance in China. And those companies do make up an important part of the dance scene today. So for example, Tao Shen Ti Juyuan is one of the most common, most sort of famous examples. They're a very widely known contemporary dance company from Beijing. There's many others like that. And so it's interesting because many of these companies, started out as independent, non-government affiliated companies, but now there's a new arts funding board in China that actually makes it possible for independent companies to apply for funding and to get resources and space. And so I think it's interesting to see how the emergence of these independent companies has sort of led to some rethinking of the way that dance choreography is funded in China and is made it possible for some of these companies to get resources. But at the same time, these companies, because they're working in an aesthetic that is much more consistent with the international contemporary dance aesthetic, many of these companies get commissions from abroad. So like the Taoye's ensemble that I just mentioned, they've gotten commissions from Singapore, from London, from different countries. They don't only rely on commissions from China. And so I think in part, those companies are catering more, I think, to an international audience, and they're able to get resources because their work is really appealing to that international contemporary dance market.
Thank you. Thank you. And one question from Diyalian. And she said, I have a question concerning the teaching system of Chinese dance. Do you think that the systematic dancing training academic somehow quiz the space and time for dancer to learn directly from nature or form, through the nature or from the folk? And since they spend most of the time learning in the classroom, and thus we didn't see as much innovation or excellent dance choreographers as there were during the period that you just introduced.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. So this is a concern that I've often heard expressed by teachers who teach Chinese minority and folk dance in China, particularly because they do see this disconnect between what's taught in the classroom and the way that these performance forms are practiced in more authentic kind of environments outside of the conservatory classroom. And so I've seen teachers really make an effort to bring folk artists into the classroom to work directly with their students. But also I've seen examples where teachers will take their students on field work, field trips to sort of gain more direct experience. So in the book, I write about one experience I had when I was taking a Han Dongbei class at the Beijing Dance Academy, and our teacher made us practice using the stilts that are used in traditional folk practices, but are rarely used in stage performance, because she wanted us to just have the bodily experience of what it was like to walk on stilts. So there are teachers who you really try to take that more experimental approach to give students a more authentic experience. And I'd say it's interesting that this is a concern for teachers. And I think the fact that it's a concern shows that teachers really do want their students to have that rich, like you said, the person who asked the question said, that's an important source for new creation, right? And even for the best type of dance choreography. So I think people are trying to do it with limited resources sometimes and limited time, but I think that is the ultimate goal of many practitioners today.
Thank you, perfect. And so there's a question from our audience. So where could I access the slide later? I think I need to check sometimes in it. I think that because there's a lot of material. So, and I think we do have a record for this talk. So I think our audience can find the record of this talk in the in CGA website or anywhere we can find that. Yes. Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And because we have many questions here and we cannot answer all of them, and because of the time minor. So yeah, I have a question from my side, from my side. So because when we talk about the Chinese dance, people may think about many different things. Like, so if someone asks you what is Chinese dance, so what's the first thing pop up or in your mind? Is
In my mind?
Yes.
For me, I simultaneously think of all the dance styles that I sort of showed at the beginning. So for me, I think Chinese classical dance, Han folk dance, and ethnic minority dance as equally important in that image.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so for me, I think the diversity is actually a central component. There's no one form.
Thank you. Do you have any question you want to answer?
Sure, yeah, so I see that Ziying Cui,
Yeah.
she's one of my PhD advisees. She asked a really good question about the hybridity of Chinese classical dance and whether or not that contradicts Chinese dance pioneers' will that Chinese classical dance was meant to be a Chinese alternative to ballet. I think this is a really important question. It gets at the heart of this broader issue of transnational history of Chinese dance. So I personally feel that the fact that Chinese dance has a transnational history does not contradict the desire to create a specifically Chinese dance form. I think actually we see this in most national dance styles. So even if we think of American modern dance, the origins of American modern dance are quite transnational, but at the same time, the choreographers are attempting to create something that's unique, and they do ultimately create something that's unique to the United States. And I think the same is true for Chinese classical dance. So I think it's actually the fact that they have such a worldly perspective and are able to draw on so many different dance styles, you know, one of which is ballet, actually makes their effort even more effective ultimately, because they're able to create a distinctive voice for Chinese dance choreography that can be recognized and appreciated internationally, but at the same time is not replicating international forms.
Thank you. Do you have any question? I think this will be our last question to answer because the time matters. So
Sure, yeah. I think maybe we need to wrap up, right?
yeah, I think so. Do you have any question? If we don't have, we will thank you for your speech, for your talk.
Or anyone, yes, or
Yeah,
anyone
thank
from the
you.
audience would like to speak directly with Professor Wilcox, that would also be very much welcome. Instead of you
Yeah.
just typing, if anyone from the audience would like to directly communicate with our speaker, that would be wonderful. Ask the last question.
So I can see one, there's tons of really good questions in the chat. Is it okay for me to just pick one?
Yes, please.
So there's a lot of really, really great questions. One of the questions that I see is why did ballet become the predominant form during the Cultural Revolution? And this is a really fascinating question because on the surface, ballet seems to contradict the proletarian indigenous emphasis of the Cultural Revolution ideology. And so in researching this question, I think for me, the answer I see is sort of has multiple elements. So one element is the fact that those other companies from Japan and Cuba performing ballet on revolutionary themes, I think really changed the way that Chinese dancers thought of ballet. It wasn't just the classical canon, it was also a medium in which Chinese dancers could articulate their own stories. And I think that that was one reason that ballet became so prominent during that period. Was it was actually seen as something, instead of seeing as something classical, it was started to be seen as something modern and something global, and something that didn't only belong to the capitalist West or even the Soviet Union, but something that actually belonged to countries all over the world. And in the early writings about the revolutionary ballets, you see this really strong emphasis on the idea that the choreographers were overturning the class hierarchies of traditional ballet works. So instead of being about princes and princesses, they were about, peasants and revolutionaries. And so this idea of appropriating a Western form and indigenizing it was actually itself seen as a revolutionary act. And then lastly, I think that because during the Cold War, ballet was one of the spaces in which the Soviet Union and the United States directly competed for cultural prestige. And I think in the mid-1960s, because China was starting to assert itself as a superpower, they had their own nuclear weapons, and they advocated the idea of the third world as something that would be equal to the first and the second world. And so I think in order to express their equality on the world stage, they felt that using ballet could allow them to compete on an equal level with the Soviet Union and the United States, sort of as a superpower. And so I think all three of those factors were important in that change that we see in the mid-1960s.
Thank you. Thank you again. And I hope at some point, so you could come to Shanghai and give more talk about Chinese dance to our Shanghai community in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, to come to the talk. And if you have more questions, you can email me or anything to our Professor Wilcox directly. And I'm sorry we cannot answer all the questions during this short period. And thank you for coming.
And I would just add by saying that, again, as Professor Wilcox has mentioned at the beginning of our event, the book is available as open access. So it would be wonderful, if we all make use of the opportunity, to read more of the contents that Professor Wilcox has delivered today in this wonderful and super rich talk. Okay, so if I'm correct, we just don't go directly to the website, right, of the book, and then we'll be able to access the contents, right?
That's correct.
All right. So thank you, Professor Wilcox. Thank you, Siye, for moderating the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. I really feel like this is only the beginning of the conversation. As I myself was looking through, the slate of questions, I was feeling like, oh my God, this could turn into another hour and 2 hours of conversation, because those questions were really wonderful, and I can see that there are a lot of audience members who are very curious about what I think is the entanglement between dance as a kind of art form with the notion, with the formation of nation state, with formation of nationhood, right, and the growing wind of nationalism, and this idea of ethnicity, that was also very much at the center of public discussion, in the first few decades of the 20th century. So there seems to be a lot of questions that we could continue to ask. So I think, despite the time limit, I think we are still happy that we sort of ended the conversation on this open-ended note, and so dance as an art form seems to be this wonderful approach for us to think more about the question of nationhood, and what Chineseness could mean in the 20th century and the 21st century. So that's my own kind of takeaway from today's extremely rich talk. So I am really, really grateful for Professor Wilcox for delivering this lecture, and to Siye for moderating. So thank you, everyone, for joining. And CGA, we'll see everyone again very soon in March.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Please take care.